U.S. Africa trade relations are not quite at their best. Washington plans to remove Uganda, the Central African Republic, Niger and Gabon from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, the U.S.'s common trading mechanism with Africa. Earlier on, Rwanda quit and Ethiopia got pushed out. And now, with uncertainty surrounding AGOA's extension after the 2025 expiration, U.S.-Africa trade ties remain perched on shaky ground. So this week on the program, we ask, is the U.S. using AGOA as an instrument of its Africa policy? But more importantly, just how much has Africa benefited from AGOA? I'm 𝐀𝐟𝐫𝐤𝐿. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining us from Kampala in Uganda, Joseph Ochieno, African Affairs commentator. From Cape Town in South Africa via Zoom, Leonard 𝐓𝐵𝐺𝐤, a political economist. And in Baltimore, Maryland in the United States, also via Zoom, Lawrence Freeman, political economic analyst for Africa. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all and thank you for joining us in this discussion. Joseph, let me start off with you. The U.S.-Africa trade relations, specifically under AGOA, have not been quite smooth as we see it now. Just recently, the U.S. expelled 4 African countries from AGOA. Earlier, Rwanda left in a half, and sometime last year, Ethiopia was kicked out of this arrangement. What exactly does this picture paint about the U.S.-Africa trade relations, especially under AGOA?
Now, that's an interesting one. I think I would simply say that it was set up opportunistically, as it were, because if it wasn't, I think in principle it would be a good thing, a good deal. Most of the countries that have benefited the most, starting with, I believe, South Africa in particular, and to an extent Kenya and Nigeria, if you like, by and large, if you look at it from a trade volume perspective, you would say they benefited. The original idea then was that this would not only boost trade, but would boost opportunities for African countries. At the same time, boosting opportunities and possibilities for creating jobs and employment. But my own hope then was it would also be about boosting skilling for industries and perhaps expanding industrial sector on the continent. If you look now, maybe 20 years back, I'm not quite sure how much of that we might save. So in principle, that was it. But part of the other question was, if you talk about countries being kicked out, including my own native Uganda, you'd say that, well, the arguments for being kicked out are related to human rights abuse. And if they are, then there's something relatively hypocritical. Because as it were, I don't think Uganda was, if you like, as free of human rights abuses 20 years ago when this was being set up than it is today. I'm not saying Uganda is okay. Actually, it has got some rather terrible human rights abuses to be concerned about.
So I will come to that in a minute, but I want to get Lawrence's view here. 20 years on, this was quite optimistically set up. Has this boosted opportunities? What's your thought about AGOA?
I think the intention was good back in 2000, but it has not lived up to what people thought it might be. Trade with Africa, between the United States and Africa, has declined massively since around 2008, 2009. AGOA also collapsed in terms of trade brought into the United States from tariff-free. It's gone up a little bit in the last couple of years. It's tiny, I think $6 billion to $7 billion. Most of it comes from about 5 countries who are utilizing AGOA. The majority utilize about 2% of the potential, and it is not transformative. It has not built what is necessary in Africa. It has not built the electricity, the infrastructure, the railroads. And therefore, it's a very small operation, several 100,000 Africans employed. But that's not going to change the conditions of life for African countries. And AGOA has now become very clear, is used as a counter to China. That's the main policy coming from the United States. And the United States is using AGOA as a weapon. It has now cut off about 7, 8 nations over the last few years from participating in AGOA, including the disgraceful kicking out of Ethiopia a year ago. So it's a political ploy, it's a political weapon, it has some benefits, but it's not going to transform Africa and it's not going to stop China.
Leonard, I want to get your view here. Several issues coming in. Trade has declined, U.S. Africa trade there. It has become a small operation. It is now a counter to China. Your view?
When AGOA was put into place in 2000, it was done with good intentions. However, as time evolved, Africa fell off as a peripheral nation, a peripheral region in terms of U.S. investment and trade cooperation, and that's when countries like China came in, as well as the other BRICS members, to palliate the lack of interest by countries like the U.S. in Africa. And as he rightly stated, the problem with AGOA is that even though it provides free access to duty-free access to African-produced products to the U.S. markets, only a few countries have really benefited from it. For example, South Africa, out of the 10 billion in trade and AGOA imported products in 2022, 3.6 billion came from South Africa, and only 5.7 billion of those products were non-petroleum products. So the transformative element hasn't really come into place. And I do agree that to a great extent, it has been used as a political ploy. My home country, Cameroon, because of human rights violations, was also suspended in 2020. But nevertheless, I think that AGOA is a framework which has a lot of potential. The problem is it lies in the hands of governments as well as the private sectors to put in place the various mechanisms such as transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, such that even the when they are able to export those products, they should be able to export products which have value add, and from there can be regional value change and other various economics or skills which the economies can benefit from in that regard.
So Lawrence, I want to explore this a little bit further. Why do you feel that trade has declined massively? What are the underlying factors here?
Well, aside from the happy talk that you got from the U.S. last year at the Africa-U.S. summit, the United States has no intention, zero, of developing Africa. It's on the lowest list. They may throw a few officials over there to visit and hold press conferences, but the United States has lost its vision. In fact, the word development has disappeared from the lexicon of U.S. policy vocabulary. They don't care. What they're trying to do is to counter China. For them, it's all geopolitics. China is their #1 enemy in the world, and they're using Africa as part of that. If we were going to improve the conditions of life in Africa, which is my dedication for over 30 years, you need much more energy. You need 1,000 gigawatts of energy. You need the high-speed integrated railroad. You need hospitals. You need schools. You need all kinds of infrastructure that would enable progress to take place. Africa continent is the least industrialized continent in the world. It has the lowest rate of manufacturing in the world. And this is because they've never been allowed to develop. AGOA will not develop manufacturing and industry.
Right.
And without that, no African nation will be sovereign. So despite the praise that the United States and Biden and other Democrats speak about AGOA, they're really doing nothing to address the essential primary concern, raising the standard of living of Africans. And this is the United States has not looked at this and does not care about this. They're using Africa as a game to go against China. It's very sad, and I don't think it's going to change in the future without a change in policy.
Joseph, let me wrap you in here. You talked earlier about what exactly AGOA is. If it is, a democracy and rights instrument or a trade and economic development initiative, is the United States using AGOA as a geopolitical tool here?
Clearly, it's a political tool. I was suggesting to you that when AGOA was coming to the peak, for example, when Uganda was being admitted at the time, the 1/3 of Uganda was in concentration camps in northern Uganda. Political parties were banned. I was personally in exile. So if it's about human rights and democracy, I'm not quite sure whether things have generally moved. So it's basically a political tool. And as already suggested by my other colleague, it's quite clearly we know that the U.S. wanted to make sure that they had a grip on the continent. But much more importantly, what has it done to, as I said, expand or boost our industrial sector in the side of the world? I'm not quite sure how much. So, if it were the case then that this was much more than politics. It would also be about helping to boost, helping to develop industrial base and also therefore competitiveness with the rest of the world, rather than simply saying, okay, we give you some tax rebates here and then tariff free on 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 different products that maybe you don't even have, if you like, a competitive advantage on.
Leonard, I want to get your view here because we're talking about AGOA being enacted since 2000, and it has been at the core of U.S. economic policy and commercial engagement with Africa. Has Africa actually benefited from AGOA?
Well, as Mr. Lawrence said, it's been very disparate. Diversified as well as highly industrialized economies, such as where I am, South Africa, have been able to develop specific sectors. I take, for example, the automobile industry in South Africa is one of the flourishing economic sectors. We have lots of foreign companies which have automobile plants across the country, and that has helped to establish regional value chains because you have, for example, the leather chairs, you have the rubber. All of these other inputs are being fed from other countries into South Africa, and they're assembled here. You have smaller countries of recent, for example, Togo and Benin, which are developing their textile industries. Like, those are large-scale cotton producers. So you have examples here and there, but then nevertheless, AGOA isn't supposed to be seen as a magic wand, because even though the framework is in place, and even though it provides duty-free access to African-produced goods, the problem is a lot of the foundational aspects aren't in place. You don't have the sufficient infrastructure, energy, roads, ports, and so on and so forth to stimulate economic activity as well as investment. In many regards, you don't have political will, because now you can have that framework in place, but then there are leaders and governments which don't know how to make the most of it. So I think it's very, very well intentioned. Countries which have, for example, the basics in place, as for example, a large industrial base, or at least a diversified economy, as well as political will, they have been able to develop. And I'm not only speaking about large economies like South Africa, but I will give an example to smaller countries such as Benin and Togo. Even though there have been shortcomings, there are countries and there are examples wherein AGOA has been beneficial to development of particular sectors across different economies.
Lawrence, I want to get your view. 36 countries, $30 billion is not really that small an operation when you look at it. Has it actually benefited Africa?
Well, out of 36 countries, only a small group actually utilize AGOA. The majority, I read, are utilizing about 2% of AGOA. South Africa and Nigeria are the only two nations that are involved in over $1 billion in trade via AGOA. Then you have Ghana and Kenya, about 500, 300 million, and then it drops off precipitously because, look, Africa-U.S. trade has dropped to about $64 billion combined import and exports. China is $282 billion. So even though there's some improvement, the overall investment in AGOA has collapsed. That said, I support any effort that will increase jobs and increase wealth in the countries, but it is very small. And that's why you have a huge poverty rate in Africa. I would suggest a much more robust and transformative effort. Long-term, low-interest credit for infrastructure is the way we have to move forward. And China has done some of it, and the U.S. has done none of it. And that's the problem with AGOA.
So Lawrence, I want to stick with your view of a more robust effort is needed, because U.S. Trade Representative 𝐀𝐟𝐵𝐺 at the recent AGOA meeting in South Africa, she did say that we would like to see this program to be more than just a symbolic one. We would like this to be more useful and effective. Her quote. Your thoughts on that?
It's all political propaganda, happy talk by the Biden administration. The Biden administration has not delivered on much of anything since the summit. The $55 billion that was supposedly given to Africa, the majority of it is existing programs that all have to be passed by the Congress. What I've been working with a group of Africans is establishing an Africa Infrastructure Development Bank that would lend long-term credit at 1 to 2 to 3% interest rates for infrastructure. It's the lack of electricity that is killing Africa. It is the lack of railroads that is killing Africa. Development is a human right, and the United States government doesn't understand that at all. So we would need to have loans specifically targeted for infrastructure, which is the foundation of any economy growing. If you look at these factories of apparel factories in Africa,
right.
They're small, they're crowded, they're low energy, they're not going to make changes that we need to lift Africa out of poverty.
We are going to be discussing the reforms in just a moment, but for now we are going to take a short break, and when we come back we will explore reforms that could reshape U.S.-Africa trade relations for win-win outcomes. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me in Kampala, Joseph Ochieno; in Cape Town, Leonard Mbule-Nziega; and in Baltimore, Maryland, Lawrence Freeman. Leonard, African countries are asking for an early 10-year extension. That is what they were asking for at the meeting in Johannesburg, while the U.S. favors changes as part of a renewal of AGOA. What exactly are these changes the U.S. Congress has in mind?
What the United States needs to do with respect to AGOA is look at Africa as a partner, somebody, a continent from which they can have more cooperation with, rather than looking at it as a pawn in this geopolitical game, because a lot has changed ever since not only 2000, but then just in the last 2 years, we had, we got the aftermath of COVID. We're having a changing global order where there's a lot more mercantilism. We saw with the U.S. and the trade wars with China. And, the COVID lockdowns had a very big disruption in supply chains, and also saw a lot of inward tendencies from government. So I think that whatever the U.S. has put forth, it needs to be in line with African desires, which is, improving structural economic transformation. We keep talking about the fact that African countries don't have the basics in order to have, diversified economies, which, are able them to produce finished goods, which, enable them to derive more revenue from exports. They also need to have, mechanisms which support agriculture. The Russia-Ukraine war has created a food crisis where not only are we having higher prices of imported goods, but then even processing food in Africa is difficult because now the fertilizers are coming from the countries involved in those conflicts. Climate change, they need to be able to put in place mechanisms which help us to address that. I'm from a country which is in the Sahel region, and climate change is affecting these countries very significantly and is a reason for a lot of the conflicts and a lot of the political instability. So I won't concentrate on what the U.S. has said in particular, but I think what I'm putting out is that no matter what they said, they need to have a framework which is in line with the current needs and desires of African countries.
Lawrence, give us your view here. What are the concerns from Congress?
Well, Congress there is a big push right now to get AGOA extended another 10 years. It's up in 2025. People want to extend it to 2035. Previous speaker talked about 2041. This is something that unfortunately, will not make the changes that are required. Look, in the rest of the world, all the various continents in the world, poverty has gone down in absolute numbers. In Africa, it's gone up. There's approximately 500 million people live in poverty in Africa. Over 600 million people have no access to electricity. Unemployment is skyrocketed. And the prices have skyrocketed. Now, this is part of a general problem in the world, but in Africa, it's accentuated. Unless we address these fundamental issues, simply bringing more products duty-free from apparel is not going to change that. A large part of it is oil. The oil industry does not produce expanded wealth. I call myself a physical economist because I want to improve the physical standard of living of people. We have to improve the amount of electricity per hectare, food yield per hectare, per capita consumption of electrical power. These are the key issues, and AGOA doesn't address them. There's a tremendous short-sightedness, a lack of vision, a lack of development coming from the U.S. The last president who had this conception was John F. Kennedy, who worked with Kwame Nkrumah to build the Volta Industry Electrical Project. And that's the last time, 60 years ago, that a U.S. president understood the importance of working with African nations to develop their nations. So we have to change the thinking in Washington. The Democrats and Republicans are bankrupt in terms of ideas of a vision of the future. And that's what I represent. So AGOA, yes, I will support it, but it does not even come close to doing what is necessary to improve the standard of living of African people.
Joseph, so clearly this is pointing to a need for reforming the AGOA trade engagement. In your view, Joseph, what reforms need to be undertaken here?
The focus must be in the broader holistic growth of Africa, and whatever projects and programs are, let them be African-led. Let the U.S., if the U.S. really genuinely wants to trade with us, if it wants to support us, to move away from some of the situations in which, here from as early as the early independence times, they were net contributors to our backwardness, as it were. Let them become enablers of this process, rather than simply becoming, an extended market, and for them, an extended market, and for us, we are sweatshop markets. You remember the case about Rwanda, where part of the conflict is simply because we are refusing to accept your second-hand clothes. So 60 years after our independence, yes, the best you can get from you is second-hand clothes. And if we don't take them, if we don't wear second-hand clothes, then no, we're not going to trade with you. In others, you're not going to access our market. So what is it that the U.S. exports to Africa? And indeed, global north, and what is it that we export to them? This is a thing that needs to be questioned. As I said, where we have coffee, where we have gold, where we have platinum and uranium, we need to begin to have a conversation that no, we want to begin to focus on this, to develop and grow this. And if you're genuine partners like Clinton attempted to push, enable us. Let's have the technology from yourselves. Let's have the resources from yourselves. Let's have some of the skills exchange from that side, so that we do some of these other things on terms. Because I still reject the idea that we grow cocoa and still cocoa prices are determined from elsewhere outside this continent.
Let me rope in Leonard here, because I want to get your view on exactly who is making the rules as to what exactly we can export to the United States. Because it's difficult to talk about the trade balance, Leonard. Shouldn't this discussion be focusing more on developing Africa's value addition, manufacturing capacity, in order to benefit more from AGOA? Who's making the rules?
And that's very important because, when I used to teach political economy, I used to say, we had the classes about free trade. I said, there's no such thing as free trade, because trade isn't free. Trade is, leveraged by who has more, the greater ability to bargain in their favor. So, for example, Africa has the raw materials, but then we don't have the industries as well as the processing mechanisms to be able to add value. In many regards, and I keep speaking to this, is there's not a political will, because in many of those countries, the leaders don't care to put in place those industries which will create, opportunities for those value addition opportunities. Nevertheless, you have mechanisms now like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which I believe should be incorporated into AGOA, and not just AGOA, because even during the BRICS summit, the BRICS Plus summit, it was mentioned that African Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to form part and parcel of that organization's engagement with Africa, because what it is trying to do is not only trying to stimulate trade, but it's trying to stimulate trade and economic activity beyond the extraction of raw materials. Because now when you're able to have those processed goods, you're able to control the prices. But then, as you've seen, I come from Cameroon, which is a leading cocoa producer. The farm, the cocoa's extracted from my home village, but then the prices are determined in London. That makes no sense. So now we have a scenario where, for example, mechanisms like the African Free Continental Trade Agreement, as well as regional trade, are promoted, but then within the framework of AGOA, because as I said, AGOA is not a magic wand in terms of promoting these economic activities, but then it can serve as some sort of framework, some sort of foundation from which African countries, economic operators, and their partners can benefit from. So I think capitalizing on these African development initiatives, while ensuring that they collaborate with trade frameworks like AGOA, will help us to be able to change that dynamic to a certain extent with respect to who's determining how much is gotten and what is produced as well from that revenue.
Right. So I want to get your closing remarks, and let me start off with you, Lawrence. What lessons can be learned from the implementation of AGOA that may be applicable to a future trade agreement or initiatives involving Africa and the United States?
Basic question is lowering tariffs or removing tariffs on imports into the United States is not a solution. It may make a certain people in Washington feel good and they may be able to give speeches and write papers about it. But the key question for me is, does it lead to an improvement of the standard of living of the people? Does it reduce poverty level? Does it produce more jobs? And the problem with AGOA, it doesn't match that criteria. It is limited, it provides a little bit of help, but it's not transformative. I want to end hunger and poverty in Africa. So the AGOA project probably will continue, it should continue, but we should be very sanguine about it. It is not addressing the needs of Africans right now. And that's the policy that I'm fighting for, is one that provides long-term credit for infrastructure development, which is the foundation of any economy. And AGOA doesn't do that. And that's the sad part about it.
Leonard, your view?
I agree. And I just want to stipulate that AGOA does have its benefits. However, it significantly needs to be reformed in the sense that AGOA needs to have country-specific plans, because they're treating Africa, the African countries, as a continent, as a single entity. Meanwhile, each country has a specificity. Some are industrialized, some are emerging, some are still in their primary stage of development. So that needs to be rectified. You also need a scenario where the U.S. incorporates AGOA into its overall foreign policy, because it's been enacted in silos. You give, for example, China, the Belt and Road Initiative, FOCAC, which is the Forum for Cooperation with Africa. They work hand in hand together, and that's one of the reasons why China has had a very successful, economic cooperation approach in Africa. The United States needs to emulate that in that regard. And above all, the U.S. needs to look at Africa as a partner when they're engaging with them, rather than looking at them as a pawn in their political game, and stop looking at them as, their engagement as, oh, we're trying to rival Russia or China, but rather as, want to, to help in the Africa's developmental process.
Joseph, you have the final word.
Yes, I mean, as it were, the U.S. has its own interest, and we have to respect that. But I think Africa needs to stop thinking that the solution to our bigger problems are going to come from outside. In fact, as I said, our struggle, including struggles for independence, even recent ones in Southern Africa, did show that, well, it was not necessarily going to come from outside. No, the quick thing is that we need very urgent leadership, and to review this, we need to begin to say that, well, investments in AGOA is going to be more investment in infrastructure, in agriculture, in value addition, in our skills, in our youth, in education and health. When we do that, and when we grow as African economies, and very quickly, when we deregulate as a continent, when we knock off visa-free and create visa-free Africa, when we kill the trade barriers that exist on this continent, which are actually rather shameful that they actually exist, maybe before we over-criticize the others. Those will be where we will make sure that whatever we seek to want to sell to actually America, whatever it is, that if we trade amongst ourselves in a much more open way, knock off the bottlenecks, it is actually possible for us to grow massively as a continent, and then we become the new darling of the world, considering the huge amount of natural resources that we do have. That we have. All we need is leadership. All we need is vision. It has to be from Africa. It's not got to be from anywhere.
All right, indeed, a very interesting discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests in Kampala, Joseph 𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐤, African Affairs commentator; in Cape Town via Zoom, Leonard 𝐵𝐚𝐺𝐤, political economist; and in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States, also via Zoom, Lawrence Freeman, political economic analyst for Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, formerly known as Twitter. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. We join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.